and I'm the artistic director of the Northern Lights Music Festival. And we have many missions, and one of them is to try to use the historic venues across the Iron Range for music, for conversation, for information. And Aaron Brown is, of course, very well known to all of you because you're here and you follow him, and you should because he's great. In any case, when I saw this topic about the Iron Range and the KKK and anti-Semitism, I thought, well, this is exactly the right place to hold such a conversation. And without further ado, because frankly, you know him very well, let me introduce you, Aaron Brown.
I tried to mention this online this week as much as I could, but the work that Vita Spancic and the Northern Lights Music Festival have done to bring so much arts and culture here to the Mesabi every summer, it's just built into such a wonderful thing. And so congratulations to them. I hope not to ruin your legacy today. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to finally be in here. I've written about this place many times, but this is my first time gracing the floor of the B'nai Abraham synagogue site and now the cultural center. And of course it's beautiful. It's been preserved and remodeled and updated. Enjoy the air conditioning, for instance. That's great. I'm really glad. Wasn't sure if that would be true, but we've got air conditioning. It's even cooler downstairs. I shouldn't say that. You should stay up here. But I do appreciate you all being here. The range is often described as a melting pot. We've heard this. America is a melting pot. The range maybe more so. And of course, when you talk about a melting pot, you have to think about that which is melted into it. There were many components melted, if we want to use that term. Since it is a mining area, we talk about how iron ore becomes steel sometimes, and you have to know that for these rocks that they dig out of the earth near here to become the car that we drove to get here, it had to go through some stuff. Like, you wouldn't want to be a piece of iron ore, probably, because it's melted down, it's heated up, it's cooled, it's heated again, it's put through all these different processes to become steel. And so it's like that for people too. You know, the people were melted into this place, but it wasn't easy. It was a hard experience. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But I did want to highlight that among those many groups that melted into our present society, the Jewish people here were a great example of one of the many groups that came to make the Iron Range what it is. And I was just looking over at the memorial wall here, and I saw Dr. Goodman's name. Dr. Goodman was, and his wife were the people who gave the money and created the Goodman Auditorium in the Old Virginia High School, which is now no longer standing. They've now consolidated schools. But in remembering their names and remembering the history and all that went on there, we can carry on that legacy. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today, is how we went from where we were to where we are today, and from there we can maybe look into the future. I want to highlight this quote went viral. It went viral for many various reasons, but I just want to talk about the quote on its face value. Vice President Kamala Harris gave this quote. It was in a speech from last year, actually, about educational equity. She said, "You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you." And then just a little bit later in the speech, she said, "Everything is in context." And I think that's a really important quote to understand, because we may not know what people were thinking 100 years ago, which is the bulk of what I'll talk about today. But we live in the context of all of the choices that people before us made, and the things that happened to them, and the emotions and experiences that they had. Vice President Harris was talking about people who have different educational opportunities based on where they're from, and that's very true, but the truth of her statement goes a lot deeper. Everything in context is a good way to understand history and politics too. The story of the United States, of Minnesota, and of here on the Iron Range, it's best understood in this context, and it's much bigger than what we see on the surface, just just like the tip of an iceberg. It's only a small part of the bigger iceberg. And like an iron ore mine, the veins run below ground. It goes deep. In fact, you can follow that all the way back to the beginning of time, or at least of human history. So this is not a coconut tree. I'm a 5th generation Iron Ranger, and my kids are the 6th generation of the Brown family to live and work on the Iron Range. But we didn't drop like pine cones from the old white pines either. We came from somewhere else, just like everybody when you go back to the beginning. And so I like to look at this painting, which I've used in a few talks. It's a print made by Josh K. Winkler. I love the art, but it's his interpretation of what the white pine forest that existed here before European settlement, what that forest might have looked like, that mature white pine forest with 200 or 300 foot tall pine trees dotting the landscape. And I like to look at that because that's a forest that is the reason we're all here. I mean, ultimately, eventually, it's the reason we're all here. But it's a forest that none of us ever looked at. None of us ever looked at it. We've seen tall trees. We might think we've seen a tall white pine tree, but we've never seen this forest with so many trees. And the description at the bottom is from a man from Hibbing who came to Mountain Iron in 1890, or very early in the mining at Mountain Iron. And he stood on a hill there, and he saw this forest before it was cut down, and he described it as a veritable ocean of pine. And he thought that it would last forever, because how could it not? And of course, just in a few years, it was, for the most part, all gone. So we are just like the stories we tell from our past. We're talking about a forest that's not here anymore. I was the first in my father's line not to work in an iron mine, ever. My dad only worked there for a short time. He was laid off in the 80s. But everybody before me spent some time in an iron mine. I do have proof. That's my great-grandfather. I just got this picture over the weekend from my great-aunt. I just love this picture. I knew this existed, but I hadn't seen it before. That is my great-grandfather, Ward George Brown, and the man in the back, the one on the left who's toiling there, that's his son, my grandfather, working in a mine down by Crosby, Minnesota. So I'm not a miner, and I'm a writer and a teacher, but I'm also, I like to think of myself as perhaps a different kind of miner. For the last 8 years, including all of the COVID period, I've been working on a book, and for a lot of those years, I was down in my basement looking at a microfilm machine, reading newspapers from 100 years ago. In fact, I spent 3 years doing pretty much that. And I read every day's newspaper from the Hibbing Daily Tribune and the Wasabi Ore and Daily News from about 1912 through 1926. Yeah, and I like to say, yeah, everyone was like, it was cool, man, but maybe that's just my insanity talking. But what I like to think of myself as was a traveling salesman sitting in a hotel room in some Iron Range town in 1920 or so. And I'm sitting in that hotel room reading the day's news, and I'm doing it every day, you know, and I'm trying to learn about this town from just this newspaper and the people who are mentioned in the newspaper. That's where this talk comes from. It's not something I was looking for. I found a lot of things I was looking for. Political history. I'm researching Victor Power from Hibbing, the mayor who fought U.S. Steel and taxed the mines to create, you know, this beautiful city in the middle of nowhere. But I also found some things I wasn't looking for. I found this. This is on the front page of the Hibbing Daily Tribune, and that's not a local picture. It's just outside Washington, D.C., the caption says, but it ran in a very large way on the front of a daily newspaper, at the time the only daily newspaper on the Iron Range. And this is just one of several. I selected it because it had interesting artwork. But in fact, news of the Klan was big news in the daily newspapers and in the local newspapers of the Iron Range for a 10 to 15 year period. Even before there were organized chapters here, much like how a trend very slowly reaches the backwaters of America, you know, we can, I don't know if this is the right crowd, but this would be like the Harlem Shake. Anyone remember the Harlem Shake? It's not cool anymore. It was about 9 years ago. Anyway, much like that trend, passing slowly into the rural areas, the Klan and its resurgence in America slowly reached northern Minnesota. It came slow and soft and sneaky, but when it came here, it was a very big part of what was going in here. Some of our ancestors were in the Klan. I just had a conversation before here, and someone literally showed me a picture of a relative wearing Klan regalia. And it is not, in my process of researching and interviewing people, it is not uncommon for people to say, oh yeah, years ago we found a trunk in the attic. We found Klan regalia. What do we do? What does that mean? And a lot of times I've not been able to trace it down exactly what they did. A lot of families probably very quietly either disposed of it or hid it away for another 100 years because they weren't ready to talk about what that might have meant. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about it. Today I want to talk about a part of Iron Range history that I think deepens the narrative we share about this place. We have a lot of heroic tales of the Iron Range. We provided the iron ore that built the ore machine for World War I and II. We built America after World War II into the modern economy. So much steel today still goes to make the things that we use every day, the cars that we drive. And so we're proud of that, and we should. But what I'm talking about is a way to better understand the context, maybe understand the choices that the people in the past made, and perhaps relieve ourselves of the burden of wondering what was going on back there, and then perhaps take positive steps forward from here on out. In historical terms, this is where I have to tell you that this is the part of the speech where if you don't tase me or stop me, I will go on way too long. So I'm going to try to keep it really short. The history of the Iron Range. And my wife likes to joke that because in an early version of the book that I'm working on, I started literally with the explosion of a distant supernova millions and billions of years ago, and the creation, the spread of iron through the universe to create planets, and one of them was ours, and I go on and on about this. So I really can't be, I can't get weighed down too deeply. So what I want to say is, in historical terms, the Iron Range formed, as we understand it, very quickly. It formed just over a few decades, really, because this land, of course, for centuries was occupied more lately by the Ojibwe, before that Dakota, and before that other peoples. But in terms of towns, with buildings that look like this one, settlement, Euro-American settlement, it went from logging country at best to small towns that we might kind of recognize just in like 20 years, maybe 10 years. You see the main street. There's elements of some of these towns, original towns, still around. A lot of them have been mined away, of course. But in a very short amount of time, a lot of things happened. And Minnesota statehood in 1858 dramatically accelerated things, accelerated exploration, especially logging. It accelerated the treaty process that ceded a lot of Ojibwe land to American and Minnesota state interests. And as a result, logging cleared away that big white pine forest that I showed you moments ago, really before our story even started. In fact, I like to point out that immigrants who came to the range on a train, usually a train from Duluth, would have looked out their windows, if they had windows, and would have seen a forest of stumps. They would have seen plains and hills and rolling hills of mud and stumps. That's the terrain that they would have seen. And just some aspen and some undergrowth still sticking up here and there, a scraggly tree once in a while. That's the environment you need to imagine when they came here. So, of course, the mining story started around 1890 on the Mesabi. Of course, it had predated that by a few years up on the Vermilion Range. Miners came, and of course, these pictures are from different eras. The ones on the left especially that steam shovel picture up at the top. That's a picture near Hibbing. And that shows why things accelerated so quickly. Some people get excited by machine pictures and some people don't. But if you look at what they're doing there, they're literally just scraping up this stuff off the top of the earth there. They're scraping up pure hematite, beautiful, beautiful stuff. They kill for that stuff today. And they actually did kill for it back then. It's really good, high quality iron ore, and they're scraping it off the ground, which meant that there was so much money to be made. And how do you make the money? Well, if you're a banker in a suit with a deed to some land or a mineral lease, and you're looking out at the field, you're like, look at all that money. How do I get it? The only answer is workers. You need workers. And so one of the things I like to highlight is that immigration, as we understand it, wasn't just some magnanimous, like, we came to America for a better life. Yes, that might have been the motivation for some of the people who came, but the reason they came was because some people wanted to make a lot of money off of mining, and that was a convenient relationship. People wanting work and people who needed workers. And that relationship is why literally boatloads of people came from Europe, came sometimes through New York, my family came through Canada, and a lot of people came through different ways. I even have some relatives, some Norwegian relatives, who came through the West Coast. I don't even know what that journey would look like. But they, Norwegians, I guess. I can make a Norwegian joke next time. But anyway, they came from all over, and their services were in great need. So they had to bring in labor, which meant that labor and immigration was an economic tool. It was something that had to happen. It was a strategy for getting that iron ore. And I just want to quickly highlight like the brewings of some of the things I saw and explain what these headlines mean. These are headlines, all of them from the Hibbing Daily Tribune. Like I said, I'm only talking about Hibbing because I happen to read all those newspapers. You could have read similar headlines in the Virginia Enterprise or other newspapers in other parts of the range. 1913, there had been something of a downturn as mines were stripping and stripping, and they had to strip with much less equipment than they have today. They can't just blast it all away and haul it away in giant 240-ton trucks. They had to dig sometimes for 2-3 years before they got down to where the really good stuff was sometimes, and there were lean years off and on as a result. So they were getting some really good stuff though in 1913, and a lot of the immigrants, they weren't getting enough of them. In fact, some of them were turning around and going back home. And in this case, we see Austrian, they called them Austrians, but what we're really talking about there are Slavic peoples from later the Republic of Yugoslavia, modern day Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, places like that. And they were coming here, but they were going back home because maybe it wasn't as good as they thought it would be. And furthermore, especially those Southern European immigrants, Southern Italians, and down the coast of Dalmatia and down in the Baltics, those people were treated not as well as some other groups of immigrants. In fact, if you go into the Oliver Iron Mining history, literally their history files at the State Historical Society, you'll find once in a while a loose-lipped middle manager who put into a report exactly the hierarchy of how immigrants should be hired. Northern Europeans first, Germans, if you can get them. Scandinavians were all right, Norwegians and Swedes. Finns, of course, if you know, are not Scandinavian. They are of a different ethnic heritage, and they were near the bottom of the list. Southern Europeans. Northern Italians were okay if you could get them, but we have all these Southern Italians. So I'm speaking glibly, but it was not glib to the people who were experiencing this kind of hierarchy. And that hierarchy, the up and the down, what your status was a huge driver of what they called Americanization. If you wanted to be more American, you had to act like people higher up this hierarchy. The Americans were the highest, called them Americans. Now in reality, they came from somewhere else too. A lot of them came from Michigan, and maybe my family was Cornish, you know, came with the first miners that came over. But the Germans came early. Frank Hibbing is an example. The guy whose namesake of Hibbing was German. And so these, you know, if we acted like the people who had been here a few years, well, then we're Americans. So this hierarchy got to be quite a driver in this economic model. Because look at what happens that same year. People are nervous about all the quote-unquote Austrians coming. But that same year, the Great Northern Railroad announced plans to bring in Negro labor from the South, African American people. And in doing so, well, this is just me reading day by day by day, something changed. All of a sudden, protests and complaints about the quote-unquote Austrians kind of diminished. And eventually, it was, the companies were actually, quote-unquote, threatening to do this because they believed that some of the people in the middle of the hierarchy would react less negatively to the Austrians that they could bring in perhaps more easily, and then therefore not want to bring in the African Americans. We're seeing the evidence of this black and white, maybe a continuum, you could call it. This continuum is American in design, and it's a product of our history with slavery. Now, the thing about it is that it's an entirely social, it's a social construct. It only matters where you are on the continuum if you believe that it matters, or in particular, if your boss or your community thinks it matters. And immigrants coming here from other places had ethnic identity. Their country, perhaps, or perhaps their religion or their sect or group or dialect, or even small communities came with large groups to parts of the Iron Range. They had that identity. But when they came to America and people started talking about black and white, they were like, what are you talking about? You know, are you talking about skin color? Not exactly. It's more about a perception. So race becomes tied to this notion of Americanization. Now, Americanization was very important to the Iron Range, and a lot of people took a lot of pride in becoming Americans, and I don't want to diminish that. But immigrants didn't come here with a sense of race, but they were exposed to a society that had these very ingrained notions of race. And they were wondering, well, what does that mean? I found evidence of this in a couple of different things, and I have them just in parentheses there. On the witness stand of a labor lawsuit, mining company foreman made the comment referring to a certain group of miners as those black fellows. He wasn't referring to African Americans, he was referring to Southern Europeans. And in identifying them as black, even though they wouldn't have called themselves black, he was saying that, well, they're lower on this racial hierarchy that they've been developing. There was another time when a fire chief was complaining about the difficulty of putting out a fire at a boarding house. And he lamented that those colored gentlemen, that's how it was printed in the newspaper, over there were not very helpful in putting out the fire. Of course, they weren't part of the fire department. They were people who were just recently homeless because of the fire. He was, again, referring to Southern European immigrant groups. And so this just shows that even these folks are coming to America and they're like, well, what do you mean? I'm not as high as this group, but this group is higher yet. Like, I don't understand. This doesn't make a lot of sense. But because what they wanted to do, if they had made the decision to stay, many of them didn't. One of the interesting things is about half the people went back home. But the ones who stayed and wanted to make an American life for themselves were really confused by these notions, and they wanted to be as American as possible. And so as a result, they tried to fit in. They tried to, okay, well, I'm one of the good ones of my ethnic group. See, I work hard, and this got to be part of the culture. Enter the picture, basically a pop culture bomb. I'd like to point out, like, the past is interesting because of the parallels. And so I would compare this to, movies aren't as exciting now as they once were, but let's say, the biggest new technology system of delivering the funny memes we all like to read on our phones and computers. The next big way of taking in information comes out, and it was movies in this case. And they had silent movies, and it was always like black and white pictures of, look, here's a man walking down the street, he fell down, that was a movie, okay? And they were like, whoa, can you believe it? You can see people moving, in real, like they're moving on the street. Isn't that amazing? Those are the movies of the 1900s and early 10s, okay? And there's a little bit of art to them, but they were very simple and short. Along comes D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation. The first blockbuster in American history. It would be the #1 grossing movie from that point, 1915, through the release of Gone with the Wind in 1939. So it's a powerhouse movie, the biggest silent movie ever. And it depicts, as you can see in the poster, and that poster would have been hanging on the doors and walls of movie theaters here on the Iron Ridge. It shows a Klansman. Why was the biggest movie of all time at that time a movie essentially about the Klan? And what it was is a film that told a story from the viewpoint of defeated Southerners after the Civil War. They felt that free black citizens were defiling their great traditions and and basically repeated all of the racial stereotypes that you might be familiar with both then, previously, and up to now. And it was basically a movie full of these stereotypes and depicting the rise of the Klan to clean up the situation, to make it safe for people again, and to bring honor in the American way back was the subtext of this silent movie. And in doing this, in having this movie in particular, and it was so much better than all the other movies that I was just describing. I mean better in the sense of technically better. It was better, they had people on horses, hundreds of extras, they replicated battle scenes from the Civil War. Nothing like this had been done on film before. And so it was a huge hit. Everybody went to see it. And in the meantime, got a healthy dosage of Klan propaganda in the process. It's strange to the modern ear to hear that, but that's what was going on. And I guess I'll get to this in just a second here, but the thing about this spread of this new Klan ideology is that it went into the North now. Now, the North had racism previous to the birth of the nation. I'm not saying that it just created racism whole cloth. People had all kinds of notions about people that they didn't know, and of course everybody's got some prejudice over especially strange or uncertain things. And so that certainly existed. But what northern towns did was this was bubbling near the surface because, again, all of the immigration happening, new people coming, economic shifts and changes, and whole-scale reordering of communities with new religious beliefs and new ethnic and political identities. It got to be, something that really terrified people. And as examples, these newspaper clippings here, all again from the Hibbing Daily Tribune. The one on the left is talking about the problems of the South being imported to the North. The New Android Hotel in 1922 hired black waiters, and it was kind of the hint of the article was people were all up in arms, maybe not sure about this, and they indicate in a very kind of racist way that they all, it's too cold for them here, so they all left, But in reality, there was a social reaction to that news. And this is an example, the one on the right here, it's interesting for two reasons. Does anyone know about Craigville? Maybe a couple. If you were a high school kid in like 1950, like my grandpa was, you'd have known about Craigville, because you could go up there and they'd serve anybody, there were brothels, and there was no law for miles and miles and miles. And so that's what it was 50 years prior to that as well. And anyway, this a black man who was working up in Craigville came down to Hibbing from Itasca County and said, hey, I just witnessed a duel. A guy killed a guy up there in Craig. And this horrible, and this guy basically shot a guy in a bar. It was terrible. And the folks in the article, police and this town officials, told him, well, that's nice, pal, but get out of town. And so what that basically indicated was that Hibbing was not by law a sundown community, what they call a sundown community, but it was, like many range towns, a de facto sundown community. That is to say that black citizens or black people couldn't be in the town after sundown. They could come during the day on business, but they had to leave at night. Now, there were examples there were a few black citizens of Hibbing, including a nurse that I write about in the book, Hattie Mosley, and a few others. And performers came through all the time with musicians and actors who were of all kinds of races. But this was an example of how they kind of had that racial hierarchy in place, even in towns like Hibbing. And of course, some towns like Coleraine, for instance, and Bowavic was another, actually had laws on the books that indicated something that they were a sundown community, but they didn't call themselves that. But there were racial constructs in their ordinances. So what am I getting at here? During this time, a lot of really crazy things happened. And I want to indicate how the racial hierarchy was involved. Finns, for various reasons. Finns were lower on the hierarchy because of, initially because of their labor organizing. Was a big part of it. A lot of them in the early days came over with strong socialist beliefs, and they were involved in the first strikes on the range. 1907 was the first big one, but they had been involved in organizing unions elsewhere. They came over literate, which was a danger to the mine owners. They could read what the mine owners were saying in the newspapers, and so that was a problem. So they were blacklisted out of the mines. But they also had what a lot of people felt were strange traditions. And if anyone's ever strolled butt naked out of a sauna, you know one of those traditions. The sauna tradition was a little strange to a lot of people, and it seemed kind of weird and mystic and not of polite society. And so things like that kind of had the Finns down near the bottom of the hierarchy. Well, in the late 19-teens, a Finnish worker was lynched in Duluth. I'm blanking on his name off the top of my head, but there was a Finnish man lynched basically in like a racially or an ethnically motivated lynching, like you would read about in the South. And then, of course, terribly in 1920, there was the lynching of the 3 circus workers in Duluth, the Duluth lynchings of the 3 black men by a mob accusing falsely, actually someone falsely accused them of rape. And no one knew which 3 people the person was accusing of rape, so they pulled 3 of the random circus workers who were all arrested and hung them in the streets of Duluth. There were literally pictures taken, and Bob Dylan talks about they're selling postcards of the hanging in one of his songs. Many believe that's referring to his birth town of Duluth. So these terrible things are happening. In addition to that, where do we go up there? Okay. Oh, and in the sundown communities. So with these things going on, obviously the stakes are high. People are afraid of what this might mean for me. So immigrants are trying to fit in. Some are trying to fit in through working hard, being involved in church, being involved in community betterment, learning English. And this is a big part of how some immigrants are motivated. But other immigrants, sometimes from the same ethnic groups, were motivated differently. And they were motivated by saying, okay, this is the game in America. I'm going to play the game their way. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to gain political power. And I'm going to best these folks at their own game. And these 2 conflicting kind of approaches to how to handle, and you might think back, if any of you are old enough to have memories of relatives who were alive in this time, you might think, well, that describes my granddad, such a nice guy. He went to church and he had very devout beliefs and he was just a good guy. And then, oh yeah, my grandpa wouldn't stop talking about the mines and he was with the Union and he fought. And so there were different approaches to this, even within immigrant groups. But the fact that the majority of towns like Hibbing, Virginia in 1915 were foreign-born, just think of that now. I mean, our foreign-born population in these towns today is definitely less than 1%. And think of how different it would be if 50% of your town, of all the people in it, literally were born in a foreign country, many speaking foreign languages as a first language. This is such a different vibe. And this is what was really scaring some of the existing power brokers in range towns. This is the pictures I wanted to show you. Look at the nice Finnish couple from Mountain Iron on the left. You know, classic kind of Americana. They work hard. They take care of their family. And then there's the guys with the kegs up there. And their bar owners were many times immigrants, became very successful bar owners, which became a gateway to politics. In fact, Victor Power, the mayor I talk about, I like to say, had a friend in every ethnic group, and he usually owned a bar, and he had access to all the voters in that ethnic group through that bar, and that was a political organization. So this was a very powerful thing. Look, that's a World War I recruiting parade, and we had record recruitment in both World War I and World War II. In fact, enlistments were higher here than I think it was Ely in World War II and it was Hibbing in World War I, among the nationally the highest enlistment rates for U.S. military service during those wars. And what that showed is here are all these immigrants now enlisting in the military, becoming citizens. Look at them, they're marching down the street, they're literally an army, okay? And this is the environment in the late teens. Again, remember the movie is brewing, the notion of white and black. The scary changing of the times. This is having an effect on different people in different ways. So let's get to the meat of why I think a lot of people came, is what happened here with the Klan. The Klan was mentioned in the newspapers back in the mid-teens, but in the early 1920s, viable local activities started to happen. This is a mishmash of clippings that I got from the Hibbing papers, and it's a third of what I saw and probably a 10th or a 20th of what actually exists out there. These are just events, incidents related to the Klan. I was starting to clip them because I was noticing so many of them. Starting in 1921, the first cross-burning that was recorded was here in Virginia. It was a cross-burning with a cross on one side of town and another on the other, and it was the night before a school board election in which Catholic candidates were running against Protestant candidates. And it was designed to intimidate. They were positioned over immigrant neighborhoods. The message being unstated: careful, don't go out and vote tomorrow. We're watching you. We can do what we want. Don't bother voting. And that was the unstated message behind a lot of those. Happened in Hibbing several times too. I'd like to point out that it's complicated because think about a society watching this happen. There were a lot of times where it was local kids who saw maybe their parents burning crosses, and sometimes it was just local kids taking some 2x4s up to the mine dump and they'd set up a cross, and of course people noticed that and it got reported. But some of these cross burnings were not done by children, because they involved heavy oil-soaked logs being skidded up the side of the mine dump. They were big installations. It would have taken at minimum many strong men, but probably some equipment as well. And so it can be definitely stated that those were the acts of large groups of adults. And in fact, we know from history since that a lot of people's families were involved in this activity. It was often portrayed not just as terrorism, though it was that, but as a civic group, a civic activity, something like the Rotary Club. Again, sorry to the Rotarians, I was a former Rotarian myself. I'm not trying to make that comparison, but think of a civic group, perhaps the Masons or the Elk or various civic groups that were legitimate mainstream civic organizations, the Klan aspired to be among them. They recruited from the membership of these groups. And their rhetoric was about mostly patriotism, things that people agreed on generally, that it's good to be a patriotic American. To be an American, you should support the Klan. And by the way, among the things that, when you got going in this, among the things we don't like is maybe all these Catholics winning elections, you know. And so this started to become kind of an indoctrination that drew in people. I was talking just before this lecture, and one of the most fascinating things about the Klan recruitment of this time, you might think, well, these are all native-born American men, probably been in country, old prospectors and people like that, who must have been in the Klan. But it wasn't. Many of the people who joined the Klan were foreign-born, Americanized immigrants. In fact, a vast majority of them were. And so you have to ask, well, why would an immigrant join the Klan? Well, why did so many immigrants join the Army during the wars? They wanted to prove they were Americans. And so this is a way of understanding some of the motivations, but it was mixed with this national kind of agenda to create kind of again, to maintain this racial hierarchy that was good for some people and bad for others. And so among the other incidents that you might have seen, let's see, the one in Nashwauk was pretty interesting. Imagine a church service happening on a Sunday morning. Service is going on. Doors in the back fly open, and in come a group of men wearing full Klan regalia, hoods, the works. They silently file into the church while people are maybe singing or while the sermon is going on. And they take that row, that back pew in the church, and they all sit down. And you're sitting in the front or the second pew. What's going on, right? And so they could tell people were nervous, and so one of them stood up and said, "We're here on a mission of peace." And then they all filed out, and they had left a bag of money on the back pew of the church. And so it was almost PR. It was public relations. We're reaching out. See, we're not so bad. And the Klan's just people like you. We spread the American way. We love Christianity. We love churches. And so this kind of outreach we sometimes see among the even hate groups today. You see this kind of outreach sometimes. So flaming crosses in Hibbing, in Virginia, in Calumet, in Chisholm, and places like it. And the big event, the one that blew my mind, that I was not expecting, if you know Hibbing, do you know DuPont Road? The DuPont is 25th Street. It's where the college is, 25th Street, Minnesota North, formerly Hibbing Community College, Glacier. And I learned that Victor Power's house, where he died, I did all this research, and I literally surveyed that mine dump behind the college in my diggies, crawling around up there looking for clues in my early days of research, and found out that his house literally was across the street from the college where I work. It had been torn down, of course, years ago, burned down actually. But that road was the epicenter of Klan activity in Hibbing. The Klan chapter was based out east of town there, and a police detective, William Sanderson, his wife and young daughter were driving home out on DuPont Road. They had a farm, and they were driving home from Hibbing one night. And they're driving down the road, and they see a man laying on the road. His car is tipped on its side. Looks like there's been an accident. So he's a plainclothes detective. Detective Sanderson pulls his car over and gets out to see what's going on. And just as he does, the man on the ground jumps up with a pistol. Some men with rifles come out of the woods, and they're surrounded. And what happens is they tell the wife and her daughter to drive home, and she takes the car and leaves. They take Officer Sanderson to another location where they interrogate him. What do you know about Klan activity? What do you know about what the police department knows about Klan activity? Are you spying on the Klan? Questions of this nature. They talk to him for an hour and they release him. And he walks back to his house a couple miles away. By the way, he says in the report that he pretty much knew, because they had masks on, but he could see under one of the masks at one point, they weren't very good, that he could kind of see who this was. It was someone who lived up there. It was probably one of his neighbors. This story ran on the front of the paper in Hibbing, and there were never any arrests. No one was hurt, but obviously, how terrifying. It ran big as life on the front of the paper. That's the police officer abducted by 5 masked men. It went on just unpunished. However, I would argue that it did create a changing tide in public opinion. Stories like that were too much for a lot of people. And from that point, you started to see kind of the fight back, the people saying enough of this. Keep in mind, I'm out in the weeds in my research. I wasn't looking for any of this, but this is pouring in through over the transom, as they say. And what I found was there were organized efforts to thwart the Klan, to mitigate their influence on society. This newspaper, which existed for a very short time, the Stunts Broadcaster, which was actually put out by a man running for county commissioner who was also under investigation for highway graft. Long story. Anyway, he didn't win, but he hated the Klan. And so he had that headline, Klan or Anti-Klan, and his newspaper gave me a lot of juicy tidbits about basically rumors about who may or may not be in the Klan. You also see speeches. Judge Martin Hughes. I think the school in Buell was named for Martin Hughes. And he was a very prominent judge, district judge, and federal judge at one point, I think, for the area, both Virginia and Hibbing. And he was very outspoken, saying we can't have this Klan activity. It's extrajudicial, it's un-American, it's unconstitutional, you cannot rule by mob. And so he was going and speaking. Knights of Columbus chapters across the range hosted speakers all the time talking about, of course, they're representing the Catholic faithful, of course, there's part of that, but they were organizing as well. One of the most inspiring scenes I can imagine is when those crosses started burning on mine dumps. People would storm up the mine dumps to stamp out the fire. They storm up there, and they don't know who's up there. We know that there's armed men behind this, ultimately. But they would storm up in Brooklyn or here in Virginia, up the mine dumps. They're hard to climb, by the way. I mentioned climbing mine dumps. If you've ever tried, they're kind of hard to climb, especially on the frontal, straight up the steep part. But they would go up those dumps, and they would stamp out those crosses. And that was a regular part of life in some of those neighborhoods that were being persecuted. And then another interesting part, maybe not the most interesting, is that they formed what they called the Iron Range Tolerance League. I had never heard of this. It was it lived for a few years, and it was founded in response to the Klan. And what was interesting about it was formed by all kinds of people, not just one political party or one religion. It wasn't just Catholic. It wasn't just a particular ethnic group or party. Two of the speakers at the first meeting were State Representative, a Republican, George Lohman, and then Bill McEwen from Duluth, who was the editor of Labor World, which is a very kind of left-of-center farmer labor publication. At the time, the Democratic Party wasn't particularly strong in Minnesota. There were a few governor elections where the Democrats got like 13% or 12%, and they were a third party, essentially, behind the Republicans and the farmer labor rights. But in this time, both of the major parties, Minnesota major parties, were involved in this, and they tried to get famous speakers like Clarence Darrow from the Scopes Monkey trial and others who spoke on civil liberties to come up and talk about the Klan. So this stuff was happening all the time. That formed in 1926. And I'll have to give you a stay tuned because I don't want to spill too many details, but the reason I went back and looked at so much of this Klan material is it ended up entering the picture for my research subject, Mayor Victor Power, whose last case involved him interrogating people and unmasking members of the Hibbing Klan chapter. Stay tuned. Power of Evidence, University of Minnesota Press, probably next year. A little aside, my main problem with the book is done. It started at 296,000 words. So that's a lot of words. You may think like, oh, I can read a book that long, and I gotta tell you, you probably don't want to. And so I need to get it down by about half. And this week, my editor finally sent me some edits and some suggestions, and he said, you know, I was reading this, and it's really hard to cut. I'm like, yeah, I know, buddy. That's what your job is. But we're working on it. We're going to get that sucker chopped down, and it'll be pretty good. And you'll find out a pretty interesting story about how the Klan may have influenced elections on the Iron Range. But one of the things that happened after this, and my time is starting to wind down, so I'm going to take us into if I'm a pilot, I'm saying we're going to be entering our descent. You may want to finish your hors d'oeuvres or your little tiny cup of Diet Coke, and we're going to be heading down. So what do we do? What happened? Where did the Klan go? Right? When I wrote a column last week about this, and one of the comments I saw was, well, what are you talking about? I grew up here. You know, I'm 70 years old, and I never saw anything about the Klan. You might not have. You might not have. In post-World War II, direct Klan activity, while there may have been some, wasn't nearly as active as it was prior to the Great Depression. It was very active in the 20s, and of course, the 20s is this wonderful time when none of us remember it. You know, our moms or dads or grandmas and grandpas, great-grandmas, great-grandmas might remember it, but not us. And so we have that kind of distance from it that allows us not to think about it. And of course, just like finding a Klan robe or hood in your grandpa's closet, it's something that we don't want to talk about, you know, if we can help it. What does that mean? Was he a violent guy? Did he kill anybody? Did he lynch anybody? Was he violently racist? He was kind of racist, but how racist was he? You know, like, it puts you through all these questions, right? And people don't want to deal with that. But I do think one of the things that helped maybe fold, if you think about folding dough, fold this episode into the dough of our past, was the Great Depression. It was a unifier of sorts. You know, times were hard, and economic necessity kind of brought communities together a little more. You know, a generation removed, you know, second, third generation immigrants getting to the times we do remember. Some of that kind of, you know, oh geez, the Italian married a Norwegian. Which, is that good or bad? I like to say my family on my mom's side is mostly Norwegian. And my great aunt, my grandpa's sister, married Leo Forboni of the famous Forboni sausage company. So we were the most Italian Norwegian family. We had a porchetta every Sunday that fell off the truck. It was beautiful. I got to really love porchetta, which is not a Norwegian dish. But that happened across all kinds of ethnic lines on the range. So now we all eat pizza, we all might have a sarma at a gathering, we might have porchetta, and of course the Cornish pasty, the food of my people, half butter, half meat. And they'll stay hot all day and wrapped in foil, you know. So those are the things that as we mixed and kind of spent time together, there was less of that direct animosity. People became accepted more as Americans. They've been here a little bit longer, particularly when they're kids. And think about this. How many times, and I know not everybody's from here, but how many times have those of you from here heard someone say, you know, well, yeah, you moved here in 1954, but you're not really from here. It drives my grandma nuts. She's from Pennsylvania. She moved to Keewatin in 53 or 54, and she's still a accent. She's in her 80s. Takes her off. She raised all these kids here. Still not good enough. But after a while, you know, all of her daughters were from the range. and I'm from, you know, I'm on my mom's side, I'm from the range. And so you get to be from the range once you're born and raised here. And so also World War II had another big effect on, you know, there was less time for that sort of thing, for that sort of division, facing the existential threats of those days. And then after that, natural iron ore started to run out, and there was economic upturn. It really kind of changed the spirit, that fuel. If you think about a forest fire, the fuel that created that clan fervor, there was not as much of the fuel anymore, maybe not the oxygen providing what that fire needed to burn anymore. But I do think that just like, you know, Victor Power, I shouldn't say this. I'm trying to keep secrets from the book. You know. Victor Power, as a young man, had scarlet fever, and he died young. He died at 45. And one of my working theories, or at least my most likely theory, is that he died as a result of heart failure from, well, partly alcoholism, but also the damage to his heart from when he was hospitalized for scarlet fever as a young man. It's this fevers, or even things like long COVID from our recent episode with COVID, things where the disease has passed, but we're living with small reminders of it, and it's in our hearts and our lungs, and it's in our bodies. It's part of us, but it's not as pressing as it was when we were in the hospital, but it's still with us. And I'd like to think that this is maybe a way of understanding this part of our history as a fever that is still with us. And even though we're generations removed, we ourselves were part of that. It was part of the people who raised us and the people who raised them. And so that is how I like to think of it. One of the examples I'll give about, and I got a couple minutes. So I was talking to somebody, he was a Swedish, descended from Swedes. And his dad worked in the mine, and his dad hated his boss. His dad's boss hated his boss at the mine because he was, well, he used a different word, but let's say a Southern European. And he was so mean to him. He hated Swedes, hated the Swedes, and he couldn't understand them. And I explained, because I had read all this stuff, I said, well, you know, that man from Croatia or from Slovenia who got to be a foreman was probably the first man of his ethnicity to get a job like that. And for his whole young years, and probably his father's years, he worked for Swedes and Norwegians and Germans and Cornishmen who were not nice to him. And he probably was taking it out on your dad. Not to excuse the behavior, not to say that was the right thing to do, but it is a way of understanding how this kind of behavior and discrimination in any form can follow us around. It stays with us. And so that's how I understand how this developed here on the range. My own family, like I mentioned Norwegians and Englishmen, Cornishmen, but we had a strain of the family that was the kind of Finns no one wanted around. People who were on the dark side of the law. And also, you know, different ethnicities. Many of our families have people on both sides of it, so it's hard to understand what am I. I don't know what I am. I'm an American, I'm a Minnesotan, and I'm an Iron Ranger, but I couldn't tell you what I am, other than Brown's English name slapped on a Scandinavian body. You know, it's hard to describe. But mostly, these attitudes that prevailed, and I experienced a lot of racist attitudes, not about ethnicity, but just regular black-white racism in school. And a lot of times I think it was just the kind of ignorance that comes from people who had been themselves put down maybe 2 generations earlier. And we see a lot of this in our culture. So what I'm saying is I'm not here to share all this to make us feel bad about being from the range or the things that happened in the past. I'm not here to tarnish the legacy. But what I think is we're trying to make life better for future generations. I think we all generally want that. And in doing that, we have to learn about the past. We have to understand the full picture so we understand maybe some of the behaviors and things. If you see kids fighting on the playground, you can't just, decide how to resolve it just by looking at them. You have to talk to both of them. You have to understand both of those kids fighting to understand what's really happening. And that's how our pastors too. We can't just listen to the good kids and the good things that happen. We have to listen to the things that went wrong too. So it's talking about Victor Power. I have to read an excerpt from a speech he gave in 1916, which is right when the KKK was rising across America, and these sentiments were just starting to take hold on the Iron Range. He gave a speech to a group of immigrants. And if you'll excuse my attempt at a Victor Power impersonation, I'm going to read this excerpt. All you have to do is imagine a doughy, pudgy, portly man in a suit coat. I hope you can imagine that. You're supposed to laugh that hard. Thank you. I did intend that joke. The preamble of this country provides liberty in every connection. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religious thought and belief. These are the principles that every true-hearted American who has the right to call himself an American possesses. In this state are men who are protected under the stars and stripes, whose every appearance is wrought with peril. Men who forgot that in the history of this country, men gave their very lives on the battlefields to enjoy the liberties of life, and who are at the present time sowing the seed of discontent and poisoning men's minds, touching on one of the sacred rights of an American, the right to worship God in whatever manner he chooses. No American who has a sense of pride in the greatest country in the world will be affiliated with any person in any way that preaches unrest or dares break the fundamental principles of what all true Americans stand back of. End quote. God bless America. God bless the Iron Range. And thank you all for coming tonight.
the turnover, I didn't properly introduce the three people. Sean Baker is the pianist, and Emilio Rudland is Chilean and lives in and works in South Florida. And Amelia Smith comes to us from California, so we gathered together all kinds of wonderful people. Now, the next duo has an unpronounceable name, and maybe they can do a better job because it doesn't sound Russian or English, so I don't know what it is. But it's a piece by Rachmaninoff that is a transcription from Fritz Kreisler. So the violinist is Martin Juarez, and the pianist again, Sean Baker. That's music I'm sure you recognize from the second half of the chair when Rachmaninoff flipped. Yes, the melody is played by the solo violin. To close our little short recital after the very interesting lecture, at least very interesting to lots of us who are here, is someone who has been at our festival for now 12 years. This is his 12th since he was a little guy, and he's now a big guy and a very important young pianist, and he's going to be playing one movement, the last movement of Stravinsky's Petrushka. Offering tonight, come to the opera. It's really great. It's not going to pass this way again. Thank you so much for coming tonight.